The moment I walked into the Hargrove family's dining room, Richard Hargrove looked at me the way people look at a stray cat that somehow wandered into a five-star restaurant, mildly disgusted, mostly confused, and already calculating how quickly he could get rid of me. "So this is the girl," he said, not to me, to his son. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table, and I smiled the way I had practiced in my bathroom mirror for a week, soft, a little uncertain, the kind of smile a woman gives when she's grateful just to be included. I was wearing a dress I bought secondhand, on purpose. "My name is Maya. I'm 29 years old. I run a consulting firm that generated $4.2 million in revenue last year. I have 11 full-time employees, a corner office on the 14th floor, and a savings account that would make most people's eyes water. I own my car outright. I've been mortgage-free since I was 27, and I once turned down a acquisition offer because the number wasn't interesting enough to justify the conversation." Daniel thought I was a junior marketing coordinator who split rent with a roommate and stressed about her student loans. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I know exactly how it sounds. Let me tell you how I got here. His name was Connor, and I loved him the way you love someone when you're 26 and still believe that love, by itself, is enough to hold anything together. We dated for 2 years. I was already building my company by then, bootstrapped, scrappy, working nights and weekends, while he climbed the corporate ladder at a mid-size insurance firm. We were supposed to be in it together. 2 people building their lives side by side. The problem started when my side started moving faster. It was small things at first. He stopped asking about my work. Then he started making quiet jokes, nothing cruel, just little comments that had a particular shape to them. "Oh, another big client? Must be nice." Or, at dinner with his friends, introducing me as my girlfriend who's basically already a CEO, in a tone that was supposed to be proud, but landed somewhere closer to uncomfortable. When I signed my first major contract, the one that told me I wasn't going to fail, that this was real and it was working, I called him first. He went quiet for a long moment and then said, "Wow, that's a lot of money for one client." Not congratulations. Not "I'm so proud of you." Just a kind of hollow observation, like he was noting the weather. We ended 8 months after that. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, very calm, very measured, and told me that he felt like he was losing himself in our relationship, that he needed to be with someone who made him feel like he was enough, that my ambition made him feel small, and he didn't think that was going to change. I didn't argue. There wasn't anything to argue. He was telling me the truth about himself, and I couldn't fix that. But I sat in my car in the parking lot of our apartment complex for 45 minutes afterward, and I thought about all the ways I had already been trying to shrink myself down. The times I had let him pick the restaurant even when I was paying. The times I had waited for him to bring up work before I talked about mine. The times I had minimized a win because I could see the tension starting to form at the corners of his mouth. I had already been making myself smaller, and it still wasn't small enough. My best friend Jess was the one who talked me off the ledge that night. She sat on my couch with a bottle of wine and told me I hadn't done anything wrong, that Connor's insecurity was Connor's problem, and that I should not under any circumstances change who I was to make some man comfortable. I agreed with everything she said. And then, 6 months later, when I matched with Daniel on a dating app and we started talking, I found myself typing the words "junior marketing coordinator" in response to his question about what I did for work. I just wanted to see. That was the honest truth of it. I was 32 months out of the most painful relationship of my life. I was sitting across from a man who seemed genuinely warm and funny and interested in me as a person, and I thought, I just want to see who you are first. Before you know. Before any of that information is on the table. I told Jess what I'd done approximately 12 hours later, full of the specific guilt of someone who knows they've started something they can't easily undo. She stared at me for a long time. "How long are you going to keep this up?" she asked. "I don't know," I said, "until I know he's real." She thought it was a terrible idea. She told me so clearly and without much softening. But she also knew where I was coming from, because she'd watched me cry about Connor for the better part of a year, and she understood what that kind of wound does to a person's trust. "Fine," she said, "but you have to tell him before it gets serious, and you cannot let it get too serious before you tell him." It got serious. Daniel was an architect. He designed residential homes, mostly, and he had the particular quality that some people in creative fields develop an ability to really look at things, to pay attention to details that most people walk past without seeing. On our third date, he pointed out the way the light was hitting a water glass on our table and said something about the angle of the windows, and instead of finding it pretentious, I found it completely charming. He opened doors. He remembered things I mentioned in passing, that I liked a specific kind of coffee, that I was trying to read more fiction, that I had a complicated relationship with my mother. He brought these things up later, not as performance, just as proof that he had been listening. He never once made me feel like my worth was negotiable. I was 4 months into the lie when he told me he loved me. We were sitting on his couch watching a movie neither of us was paying attention to, and he said it the way people say true things quietly, without a big announcement, like it had just risen to the surface naturally. I said it back. I meant it completely. And the guilt, which had been sitting in my chest like a small stone since the beginning, got a little heavier. I kept telling myself I would tell him soon. After I was sure, after a little more time, Then he told me his parents wanted to meet me. The Hargroves were what people mean when they say old money. Though Richard Hargrove had also made plenty of new money of his own, he ran a real estate development company, the kind that builds luxury condominiums in cities where the median rent is already too high. Daniel's mother, Eleanor, had been a social event planner before she retired, and she wore her graciousness like a well-fitted coat, effortless on the surface, clearly constructed underneath. Daniel had told me about his father the way you tell someone about a difficult piece of terrain, not to discourage them, just to make sure they know what they're walking into. Richard had opinions about what women should do with their time and energy. He believed that a woman's primary ambition should be domestic, and he'd never been shy about saying so. He had once told Daniel's previous girlfriend, who was a pediatric nurse, that her job sounded emotionally exhausting, and that he didn't know why young women today were so determined to make their lives harder than they needed to be. Daniel had not spoken warmly about this memory. I dressed the part, a modest floral dress, low heels, hair down. I carried the kind of purse that says I'm trying without suggesting I have much to try with. I practiced talking about my cover story, the marketing coordinator position, the small apartment, the manageable but not remarkable life. I was calm. I was prepared. What I was not prepared for was the way Richard looked at me when Daniel introduced us. It was a look I recognized. I had seen it on Connor's face in smaller doses, spread over months. But Richard wasn't bothering to distribute it subtly. He looked at me, and in his expression, I could read an entire assessment completed in under 4 seconds. Not from money, not from the right world, probably not staying long. Marketing, he said when I told him what I did. He said it the way people say words they don't find interesting. Entry level? Coordinator, I said pleasantly. Right. He turned back to his drink. Eleanor was warmer, at least on the surface. She asked about my family, where I grew up, whether I had siblings. She was performing interest, but it was at least a performance. It was more than Richard was offering. The dinner itself was exhausting in the specific way that dinners are when one person at the table has decided you don't belong there and isn't hiding it. Richard talked extensively about his company, about a development project in Nashville, about a charity gala he and Eleanor were sponsoring. He included Daniel in every story. He directed questions to Eleanor, to Daniel's older sister Claire, to Claire's husband Marcus. He spoke past me with the practiced ease of someone who has never had to work at making people feel invisible. It came naturally to him. Claire was her father's daughter in most of the ways that mattered. She had the same flat assessment in her eyes, and she spent most of dinner asking Daniel pointed questions about his work while managing not to ask me a single thing. Marcus, her husband, was polite enough and mostly silent. After dessert, while Eleanor and Claire were in the kitchen, Richard turned to me in a way that felt deliberate. Daniel tells me you rent, he said. I do, I said. And your family? Are they local? My mother is in Ohio. My father passed when I was in college. A small nod, the kind that doesn't mean anything. It's good that you're practical about your circumstances, he said. A lot of young women your age have unrealistic expectations. I looked at him evenly. I think I have pretty accurate expectations. He smiled in a way that did not reach anything above his mouth. I'm sure you do. Daniel, to his credit, stepped in before I could say anything else. But on the drive home, I watched the streetlights move across the window and felt something settle in me that was hard and clear and certain. I wanted to tell Daniel the truth. I had wanted to for weeks. But now I also needed to understand something specific. When his father's dismissal was the loudest thing in the room, when being with me came at a cost with his family, what would Daniel choose? I wasn't testing him to be cruel. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't setting a trap or running an experiment with no regard for how it might hurt him. I was trying to understand something real before I handed him the full truth of my life, because the full truth of my life was the thing that had cost me the last relationship I'd been certain about. The next few months were not easy. Richard made his feelings known through strategic deployment of small exclusions. A family golf weekend that Daniel was invited to and I was not. A dinner reservation at a restaurant where they happened to run into Daniel and did not call ahead to say it was a family gathering. Comments made in front of Daniel about the importance of financial compatibility in a relationship, which were clearly pointed at me even when Richard wasn't looking at me. Daniel pushed back on each one. He told his father the golf weekend was thoughtless. He came home from the surprise dinner early and spent an hour on the phone with his mother, telling her that this needed to stop. He had a direct conversation with Richard that Daniel described to me quietly and without drama, only saying that his father had been told clearly that I was part of his life and that treatment like that was not acceptable. I listened to all of this and felt the stone in my chest shift slightly, just slightly, into something warmer. But there was also this. The lie was becoming its own kind of pressure. It wasn't just that I was hiding my career. It was that every time Daniel mentioned money, every time he paid for a dinner I could have paid for 20 times over, every time he carefully suggested a more affordable vacation option because he was being considerate of my supposed budget, I felt it, the weight of it, the wrongness of it. Jess called me every 2 weeks and said, "Have you told him yet?" Every 2 weeks I said, "Not yet." "Maya," she said, in the specific tone she reserved for when she was being serious, "this is going to hurt him. The longer you wait, the more it's going to hurt him. You know that." "I know," I said. "Do you love him?" "Yes." "Then tell him." The thing that finally made me tell him was not a confrontation. It wasn't Richard saying something unforgivable or a moment of crisis or a dramatic turning point. It was a Tuesday night, very ordinary, and we were sitting on my couch. The couch in the apartment I was renting in a neighborhood that I had specifically chosen because it matched the income level I was pretending to have. And Daniel was looking at his laptop with a small crease between his eyebrows. "Hey," he said, "I've been thinking about something." "Okay," I said. He turned the laptop toward me. It was a listing for a house, 2 bedrooms, small yard, in a neighborhood about 20 minutes from the city. Not expensive by some standards. Firmly out of reach for a junior marketing coordinator. "I know it's probably fast," he said. "And I know the timing is." He paused, reconsidering his words. "I just want to think about a future with you. And I keep thinking about this house." I looked at the listing. I looked at his face. And I thought about all the decisions that were being made based on a version of me that didn't exist. "Daniel," I said, "I need to tell you something." He closed the laptop. He looked at me with an expression that was careful and still and a little afraid. "Okay," he said. I told him everything. I started at the beginning, Connor. The relationship, the ending, the specific wound it left. I told him about the first night we matched and why I had typed those words. I told him about the firm, the revenue, the real apartment I owned, 2 neighborhoods over that I wasn't living in because I couldn't figure out how to explain it. I told him about every dinner he'd paid for, that I had quietly planned to pay back some other way, about every budget conversation that had been theater, about the coat I wore to his parents' house that I had specifically bought used because I was still performing something. I did not cry while I told him. I had decided before I started that I was going to tell him clearly, because he deserved that. He deserved the truth told with both hands, without softening or excuse. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long time. He got up from the couch and walked to the kitchen. I heard him run the tap and pour a glass of water. He came back and sat down. Not next to me, but in the chair across from me, and he looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. "How much?" he said. I told him. He laughed a short, involuntary sound, not happy exactly, just surprised. Then he pressed his hand over his mouth and looked at the ceiling. "Maya," he said, finally, "I've been picking restaurants by price for months." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. I suggested we road trip to save money on flights for the summer." "I know." He was quiet again. The thing I had been most afraid of was happening, the silence, where I couldn't tell what he was calculating, what was shifting in him, whether the version of me he'd loved was being overwritten in real time by this new information, and whether the new version would be someone he wanted to stay for. "Did you ever trust me?" he asked. It wasn't angry. That was the thing that made it harder. It was just a real question. "Yes," I said. "That's not what this was." "Then what was it?" So I told him about Connor again, more specifically this time. About the way it had ended, and the particular shape of that wound, and how I had arrived at our first few conversations, still carrying it and looking for some way to understand what he was made of before I handed him information that had ended the last thing I had believed in. "I was trying to find out if you were real," I said, before the other things were on the table. I know that's not fair. I know it doesn't justify it. I'm not asking you to say it was fine. I'm just telling you why." He looked at me for a long time. His expression had moved through several things while I was talking and had settled somewhere that I couldn't immediately name. "The thing is," he said slowly, "I don't care about the money. I want to be really clear about that. I don't care if you have it or you don't. I don't care what the number is. That's not what's sitting with me right now." "I know," I said. "What's sitting with me is that I fell in love with you," he said. "I fell in love with how you think, how you talk about things, what you care about. I fell in love with the way you push back when you disagree with me, and the way you get quiet when something is bothering you. None of that was fake. You didn't pretend to be a different person. You hid one thing." "A significant thing," I said. "Yeah," he agreed. "A significant thing." He looked down at the glass in his hands. "I'm angry. I want you to know that. I'm not going to pretend I'm not. You should be. But I also think I understand it," he said. "And I think if you had come to me at the beginning and said, 'Look, I've been hurt before. I need a little time before I show you everything,' I would have said okay. You didn't have to build this whole," he gestured at some invisible architecture of the lie. "You could have just told me you needed time." "You're right," I said. "I know. I handled it badly. Why didn't you tell me earlier?" "Once you knew?" "Because I was afraid," I said, "and the longer I waited, the more afraid I got." He nodded, slowly, the way people nod when something lands correctly. We sat with the silence for a while. Outside, the street was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a neighbor was watching television, and I could hear the faint shape of the sound through the wall. "I'm not done being angry," he said. "I need you to know that. This is going to take some processing." "I know, but I'm also not going anywhere," he said. "Because I don't fall in love with people easily, and I fell in love with you, and the version of you that I fell in love with is sitting right here telling me the truth finally, and I think I'd like to keep working with that." I let out a breath I had been holding for approximately 4 months, he told his father 2 weeks later. I was not in the room for that conversation. Daniel made that choice on his own. He felt it was something he needed to do directly, without me there, because he wanted his father to hear it without the distraction of my presence. He came home and sat down at my kitchen table, my real kitchen table, in the apartment I actually owned, which he was seeing for the first time, and which he had spent approximately 3 minutes walking around in silent astonishment before sitting down, and he told me how it went. Richard had gone quiet when Daniel told him. The quiet had lasted a while, and then he had said something about how he had known there was something off about the situation, which Daniel told me he had chosen not to engage with. Then Richard had said something about how a woman with that kind of ambition was going to be a challenge, and Daniel had told him clearly that this was not a conversation he was interested in having. "He'll come around," Daniel said, without much certainty. "He doesn't have to," I said. "Not for my sake." Daniel looked at me across the table. "He will for mine," he said, "because I'm not negotiating this." Eleanor called me herself 3 days later. She was gracious in the particular way she had always been, surface warm, architecture underneath, but something in her tone had shifted. She said she admired my success, said it in the specific way people do when they are recalibrating an assessment and being honest about the recalibration. She asked if we could have coffee sometime, just the two of us, and I said yes. Richard, to his minimal credit, shook my hand at the next family dinner. He did not say anything meaningful. He did not apologize. But he asked me a question about my business, a real question, with follow-up, and he listened to the answer. It was not a transformation. I am not going to tell you it was a transformation, but it was something. Jess came over the weekend after Daniel and I had our conversation, and I sat across from her and told her everything that had happened. She listened the way she always listened, fully, without interrupting, saving all her responses for the end. When I finished, she said, "So he stayed. He stayed. And he was angry." "Appropriately angry," I said. "He was angry the right amount." She smiled. "That's actually kind of perfect." "I know," I said. "You were a complete disaster," she said warmly. "Just for the record, you handled the whole thing badly. I know that too. But," she said, "I think you also found out what you needed to find out, which was the point." She picked up her coffee. "He loved you when he thought you were barely making rent. He stayed when he found out you'd been lying to him for months. And he told his father to back down without being asked." She shrugged. "That's not nothing, Maya." "It's not nothing," I agreed. We found the house. Not the one Daniel had shown me on his laptop that one sold before we got our act together, but another one, smaller, with a better yard and a kitchen that made Daniel happy in the specific way that architecture makes people happy when things are designed correctly. We put both our names on the paperwork. The morning we signed, Daniel looked at the documents for a moment, then looked at me. "For the record," he said, "you could have just told me." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." "Stop apologizing," he said. "I'm not going to keep accepting apologies for it. I've processed it. We're past it." "Okay," I said. "But if you ever lie to me again—" "I won't," I said. And I meant it the way I had meant "I love you" on his couch, the way I mean the things that matter quietly, without performance, like something that has simply risen to the surface and become true. He signed the paperwork. So did I. Outside, the city was doing what cities do on ordinary Tuesday mornings, people walking, traffic moving, the world continuing regardless, and I stood in the parking lot of the title company and thought about all the ways a person can protect themselves. And all the ways protection becomes its own kind of damage, and how strange and lucky it is to find someone who, even after seeing the damage, decides to stay and help you figure out what comes next. I thought about Connor for exactly 30 seconds. Then I didn't think about him anymore. There are men who will feel made small by who you are. That is a real thing, and it will hurt when you find them, and the hurt will make you want to make yourself smaller so it doesn't happen again. I understand that impulse completely. I followed it further than I should have. But there are also men who look at who you are fully, clearly, including the parts you were afraid to show, and decide that's exactly who they wanted to find. And the only way you will ever know which kind you have is to eventually, even if it terrifies you, put down the performance and let them see. I learned that later than I should have. I caused more confusion than was necessary. I don't recommend my method, but I found out what I needed to know, and I kept the house.